Hello, and welcome to our presentation, where we'll be discussing our paper titled Adapting to Movement Patterns for Face Recognition on Mobile Devices. This work was conducted by myself, Matthew Boakes, as part of my PhD, along with my two supervisors and co-authors, Richard Guest and Farzan Daravi. Here we present a novel adaptive approach to mobile face recognition. Looking briefly into the motivation and inspiration behind this work, biometrics have seen a continued increasing use as a method of authentication and are said to be on track to authenticate the vast majority of payments within the next 10 years. This increase can partly be attributed to the technology's inclusion into mobile and smartphone devices, providing greater consumer access to the technology. Static biometric systems such as eGates can create a suitable environment for optimal operation and can rely on a fixed decision threshold. However, the same environmental and operational scenario guarantees cannot be made for mobile devices, suggesting a more adaptive approach is required. Previous work and a trial analysis presented in our paper suggested the need for an adaptive approach. Here we present our adaptive scenario threshold framework. On the left is a simplified version of how the decision component of a biometric system generally performs. The framework on the right showcases our theory. The idea is to detect the operational scenario where the authentication occurred and set unique thresholds accordingly, resulting in a potentially more secure operation by tightening the decision threshold where possible, versus having a fixed static threshold to account for every known possibility. With the theory in place, we proceeded to conduct a data collection to test it. We had a total of 25 participants collect data for this study, the vast majority of which were university students, and hence we are looking at a student population, with 76% of participants under the age of 30. We had a gender balance of 52% female to 48% male, and the device we used for this study was the Android-based Samsung Galaxy S9, which captures selfies in 5.2 megapixels. All the data was captured in one visit. We can divide our process into two parts, an online data collection with an offline analysis and prototype. We developed a custom Android application for data collection purposes that tasked users with taking a selfie and collecting the sensor data. Firstly, we enrolled users into the device's own face authentication system. For each scenario, the users took a selfie, which would immediately be followed by the device's inbuilt authentication system to collect the sensor data. The user would then repeat this a further 5 times before moving on to the next scenario. We then created our prototype offline using 2 main open-source Python libraries. The face recognition library, which we're using as our face recognition algorithm. This recommends a threshold of 0.6, which we're using as our baseline going forward. It produces dissimilarity scores between 2 images. And the scikit-learn library, which will be used to produce an automatic scenario detection classifier. We have chosen 4 scenarios for this study, 2 stationary and 2 motion. They are sitting in a chair, standing, walking on a treadmill, and walking down a corridor. The aim was to pick simple, everyday scenarios that users may operate a smartphone within, and we chose a treadmill to allow for simulated walking in a controlled environment. The scenarios all took place indoors, as one of the study's goals was to see the effect of motion in mobile biometric systems, and hence we wanted to reduce as much external impact as possible. An unpaired two-tailed t-test showed a statistically significant difference between the stationary and motion scenarios' genuine scores, highlighting a potential need for unique thresholds and motivating this work. This table showcases the amount of images we collected as part of this data collection, and each one represents a single biometric transaction. We used our face recognition Python library to first detect if it was able to detect a face within the image. If it was not, we disregarded it for the rest of the study, meaning we ended up with a total of 139 faces for the sitting scenario, 123 for standing, 116 for treadmill, and 120 for corridor, resulting in just under 500 images at 498. Our first step in bringing our adaptive framework to life was to figure out a process for automatic scenario detection. We used a total of 4 inbuilt device sensors collected in the background during the authentication as features. We used 2 motion-based sensors consisting of the gyroscope and linear acceleration, and 2 position-based sensors consisting of the magnometer and the orientation. All these sensors operate on an XYZ axis system, and we configured the sensors to run at a delay of 200 Hz. When we translated the data into features, We took the magnitude of the gyroscope, linear acceleration, and magnometer for each data point, and the median value of the orientation over the entire transaction. Our final feature was a biometric quality assessment using a face image quality score. We used two existing open source Python algorithms to achieve this. The process works by taking a facial image. We then pass the image through a multitask cascaded convolutional neural network that crops the image to the facial region, and we do this because the image quality algorithm recommends it. To obtain a face image quality score, we are using the FaceQNet system, which again uses a convolutional neural network to predict a specific input image's suitability for face recognition purposes. This system provides a quality score between 0, meaning low quality, and 1, meaning high quality. We use the following approach to train and produce our classifiers. We started with our complete set of scenario-labeled transactional feature data. We then randomly split this data in half, meaning that at least half of the data would have been unseen when it came to evaluating the full adaptive approach. From here, we further split this data, using 2/3 for training and the remaining 1/3 for testing purposes. We estimated the accuracy using k-fold cross-validation with a fold value of 5 to report an F1 score. We then trained our model using this training data to produce the classifier. This was achieved using the Python scikit-learn library. Using the testing set, we were able to evaluate the testing accuracy, giving us an indication for the classifier performance. We repeated this process with a new random split of data 5 times and selected the best classifier model for our prototype. We found that the k-nearest neighbor algorithm with a k-value of 3 provided the best accuracy. We created different classifiers to explore a range of options. The fundamental classifier to detect between stationary and motion-based scenarios, a 4 scenarios classifier for the individual scenarios that we are exploring as part of the study. Additionally, we also created individual stationary and motion classifiers to distinguish between the 2 scenarios that fall under each category. The table here highlights the best results based on the obtained F1 score and the accuracy, and are the classifiers we used for our offline prototype. We also need to decide upon how to handle imposter testing so we could best evaluate the false accept rate. We wanted to examine and compare the systems with a worst-case passive imposter approach to stress test and potentially examine weak points in the system. To this end, we created an algorithmic approach to selecting tailored imposters. As a concept for facial recognition, we wanted to try the system against people who looked similar and therefore were most likely to cause a false accept to occur. We collected demographic information from our participants, and the diagram here represents our logic for selecting. The aim is to select as many imposters from the most concentrated group at random, and when none are available, we begin selecting from the group above until we obtain the desired amount. Because we are working with a relatively small set of 25 participants, most of our imposters usually came from the group combining the gender, age, and ethnicity. We aim to explore this approach going forward to replace a traditional random selection of imposters. Another question we faced was how many imposters per genuine user should we use, and we concluded using 4, resulting in a total of 2,015 imposter comparisons. We needed to decide what thresholds to use for the individual scenarios we wanted to explore. For our initial proof of concept, we wanted to explore using a global threshold for each scenario. An alternative approach would be to create unique decision thresholds that represent the scenario data for a particular user. Similar to how we created our scenario classifiers, we used a random 75% of our genuine match score data for threshold predictions, meaning that the remaining 25% was unseen when we later trialed the full approach. We explored using the 95th percentile and maximum score obtained from this data as thresholds. We also calculated and included the equal error rate as another possible threshold by including a random 75% of our imposter scores. This was repeated 5 times, selecting random data for each trial, creating new threshold values, and so as to avoid accidentally gaming the system in any way. Bringing everything together to showcase our offline trial, we produced a Python prototype. Using a participant's first sitting image as the enrollment reference, we used the face recognition library to extract features. We then used our collected transactional data for that participant, consisting of a selfie image and the collected sensor data. The sensor data and features were passed to our classifier to provide a predicted scenario, and based on the assigned scenario, we alter the decision threshold accordingly. Once we compare the probe image to the previously stored reference and a match score is obtained, it can be conditioned against the decision threshold to see if we deem the comparison to be a match or a no match. We can then calculate the false reject rate accordingly. We then repeat this using the same reference template, but using the chosen tailored imposter's data to examine the false accept rate. Although we trialed this approach offline, we see the possibility of replicating the same procedure on a smartphone, with the most significant limitations being computing power and timing. We wanted to demonstrate both our adaptive threshold approach and tailored imposter theory. We studied how the false accept rate changes for both the algorithm's baseline, that recommends a fixed threshold of 0.6, and our adaptive approach with varying thresholds. To produce this graph, we altered the number of tailored imposters per genuine user from 1 to 10. We randomly selected 450 comparisons from the imposter comparison pool, and we repeated this 3 times and took an average. We can see that the baseline's false accept rate declines as the imposters become more diluted with less tailoring. However, our adaptive approach outperforms the baseline with the most tailored imposters and continues to do so. This graph also verifies that our algorithm works at picking tailored imposters. From the graph, we can see that the algorithm begins to level off after around 4 imposters per genuine user, which provides part of the reasoning for using this amount. This table showcases some of the results we were able to achieve using our adaptive method. We explored 3 combinations. Firstly, classifying between stationary and motion-based scenarios, followed by classifying all 4 scenarios separately. We finally trialed a combination of 2 classifiers. Firstly, to separate into stationary and motion, and then into specific scenarios to see if that alters the performance. We also experimented with the different threshold values, the 95th percentile, the maximum, and the equal error rate to see the impact. As you can see, we achieved our best results when using our stationary and motion classifier with the equal error rate threshold, and our worst results when using the 95th percentile. However, in all cases, our approach succeeded at reducing the false accept rate. We also compared our results once more to the algorithm's baseline and what a perfect scenario classifier could achieve, that being a classifier that correctly predicted the scenarios 100% of the time. As we can see, there is still room for improvement. Having successfully trialed the approach on one device, we wanted to see if it was interoperable. And so to verify this, we repeated the process with data collected from a further 30 participants using the Google Pixel 2, and we were able to demonstrate a similar improvement, which was capable of reducing the false accept rate to 0% over this algorithm's baseline of 9.5%, thus beginning to prove that the adaptive threshold can be interoperable. We equally acknowledge this has been a proof of concept, and further testing is required, including testing in a more diverse range of environments and conditions, testing with more devices and algorithms, and finally testing of targeted attacks and adaptive presentation attack detection. To summarize the work that we have presented here today, we presented a proof of concept for a novel adaptive approach to biometric authentication for a mobile device, something that has been identified as currently lacking in the literature. We did this by proposing the creation of an extendable adaptive framework, which works by altering the decision threshold based on the scenario. We utilized smartphone sensors to create an automatic scenario classifiers, and in all cases were able to achieve a testing accuracy of above 90%. We showcased a method for choosing targeted imposters to better stress test the approach using worst-case imposter data. And we demonstrated the proposal's potential merits using data collected from a commercial device and an open-source face recognition algorithm. In our best case, we were able to achieve a result that gave a false reject rate of 0.42% and a false accept rate of 0.35%, a reduction of over 95% of the algorithm's baseline, which recommends a threshold of 0.6. This was when we used the EER threshold and a stationary motion classifier to separate the data. I would encourage you to check out the paper for an in-depth description of our methods and results. Please feel free to reach out and contact me with any comments and questions regarding the work presented here. And finally, I would like to thank you for allowing me to present and listening to me today.